All right, all. Well, welcome to the last session of the Oregon Cyber Resilience Summit. Thank you for being here and being strong, the holdouts. Yeah. And also this room, I'm like, somebody needs to jack up the AC a little bit more because like it's going to get a little warm. You're a bunch of 98.6 degree space heaters in here. So if you're starting to drift off, just catch yourself a little bit. We'll starting to see the head bob. Well, I'd like you to help me welcome Brian Myers. He's an independent consultant helping software businesses with information security. He's held senior roles at WebMD, Silicon Valley Startup, and Leviathan Security Group. Authored 3 books on Windows programming. And this looks like a fascinating topic here that kind of wraps up that thread from this morning and just ransomware. And we're going to have a really good concrete example here. And Brian has also promised not to do this entire session in an Irish accent. So welcome, Brian Myers. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jim. I'm really grateful. Hi, my name's Brian. Welcome to Kidnapping a Library. I've got a lot to cover, and I'm going to try to do it in a fairly short time, so I'll do my best to be efficient. As part of my work earlier this year, I was researching how ransomware works in order to invent a plausible scenario to help a client with a tabletop exercise to test their disaster recovery program. And as I was doing that research, I stumbled across this report, which is an 18-page report put out last March, written by the British Library, summarizing what happened when they were hit by ransomware last October, October 2023, 5 months before this report came out. And it is full of admirable clarity. I wish all companies, I mean, this is not a private competitive company, and that I think let them be a little freer in explaining what went wrong and what mistakes they made and what they're going to do about it. They are humble and transparent and very clear and very useful. So this turns out to be, this 18-page report is my primary source for what we're going to walk through. And it turns out to be a great place to look to learn things. From now on, when I refer to the report, I mean that 18-page March report. And I have a link to it on the slides at the end. You don't need to take notes. I've given the materials to the conference. You'll have those links. Right. Whoops. Right, so the British Library is the National Library of the United Kingdom and one of the premier cultural institutions in the world. I'm giving you just enough information about the British Library to understand their business so that the attack will make sense. I'm not giving them a commercial. I'm actually giving you what I hope will be useful information. They are continually growing. They were founded in 1972 by an act of parliament when they took the book collection from the British Museum and gave that to this new institution. And they have been growing steadily ever since. And the point of this slide is to show you that they are regularly ingesting and absorbing other very diverse collections from different places that must all come with their own IT systems, their own catalog systems, their own security. They don't say this in the report. I'm inferring a little bit, and it becomes clear my conjectures here fit with what happened, so it's an informed guess. That's how their business grows, just like many of businesses you probably work in, acquiring things, merging things, working with legacy stuff, trying your best to find some way, even if it's clunky, to have stuff integrated and information flow. That's the kind of situation I see at the British Library, reading between the lines. This library has everything from the Magna Carta to handwritten lyrics by the Beatles. They have a place to store it all. They have millions of over 100 million printed artifacts. They have miles of shelves to store these things. They have even more digital content that doesn't need to be on shelves. The shelves, of course, if you have something of that scale, it's hard to find the book you want. Where do you go? Which librarian can reach up to that top shelf? They have mechanical systems that are run by software that will go to a shelf somewhere and pull down what you need. And this particular facility is in Yorkshire because they don't have room in London for all of it. So you go to London, you order a book, it may come the next day by shuttle from Yorkshire. That's how big this place is. They have a cafe in London. They have an online bookstore. They put on exhibits. This one last year about Harry Potter was highly popular. It used many objects related to magic, not all directly Harry Potter, from their collection. Their exhibits go on tour. They lend out objects for other people's exhibits. They work with international partners to preserve endangered archives and materials around the world. This is a big, important organization with a huge impact. I asked myself, what information systems do they have? And you can begin to guess. That's why I gave you those slides, in order to populate this list. Clearly, they have a public-facing website with a lot of interactive features on it. They have online learning materials there that are used heavily by schools. That's where you register as a reader. You can order books there. You can access the digital content from their public website. They also have an internal network, just as any business does, that handles HR, finance, email, file shares, all those things. And they have point-of-sale systems, so they can do sales in their shops with credit cards. They have PCI certification for credit card handling. And they have, of course, the main thing, are the library catalog itself, which must be, I'm inferring again, something very customized. No off-the-shelf package would help you manage a library with a collection like this. So this is a pretty substantial organization with substantial resources. I can infer also from the report that they have a pretty sophisticated security program in place. They don't outline it, but in various places they mention the things I put on these slides. I pulled out whatever the program is, it has all these elements. And just to mention a few, they have firewalls from reputable brands we know. They have governance programs with risk management. They have security plans for addressing the highest risk on some reasonable time frame. They have people with titles like Business Continuity Manager. They had a security certification called Cyber Essentials. They have done things. They're not ignorant. They're not rubes and ripe for the plucking. So it's interesting that they were a victim of an attack. All right, so first I told you a little about the British Library. Now I'm going to walk through the steps of the attack, just enough to give you a sense how that played out. The attacking agent was a group called Rysida, which is well known. There have been CISA advisories about them. Actually, it came out about the same time as this attack. This image is from their website. They have a website. Rysida is a genus of centipede, and that's what they've named themselves after. This is their general modus operandi, and to quote our speaker this morning, they don't break in, they log in. That's the most important point on this list. They typically, when they can attack someone, they look for targets of opportunity. They're not targeting any particular industry. Their motive seems to be profit. They look for a place they can get in by compromising credentials. They don't find some 0 day to break into your VPN. They go in the same way your employees do. They are, or your staff or your partners. They find somebody who has access, and they get those credentials by any of the normal means for doing that. Password spraying, phishing, whatever they can succeed at. We don't always know how they got the account, but that's what they do. Then they do clever things, trying to get all the way around the network, find all the things they can, escalate privilege, identify sensitive material, copy that down. They're not going to just encrypt your software. They're going to steal your data too, and encrypt the data. It's a double extortion scheme. And this is what actually happened to the British Library. We don't have as much detail as we might like because Rysida was good at covering their tracks. And I'm not going to walk through each step, but basically it's clear after the fact from forensic evidence that Rysida was active in their network in October. We're pretty sure we know that they got in through a particular server, a terminal services server, that is set up for employees to come in and use it at network, normal thing, normal protections. Interestingly, they did not have MFA on this server. They had MFA elsewhere in their network on the cloud properties, but they deemed it too difficult to configure it the first time around on the internal network stuff on their own hardware, and so they put that later down the road. They had a plan to put MFA up. And the lack of MFA certainly contributed to Rysida's ability to compromise someone's credentials and get into that server. Once they're in, they copy full sections of network drives, and they do searches across all the files they can find for things that contain particular words like confidential or passport, and they take all those files too, and they copy them down. That's directly from the report. We know that Rysida in this attack did those searches to find content. Then early on the morning of Saturday, October 28th, they completed their attack by running the ransomware. I'm sure Saturday morning was not an accident. They chose the time that would be understaffed for creating greatest chaos, clearly. And that resulted in an IT outage. And if you are the IT manager on call at 7:30 that morning when the systems are down and you log into a Windows server, you would see something like this. All your files have a new file extension. It used to be a JPEG, now it's a Rysida file. It's been encrypted, you can't open it, it's useless to you. The only thing on the system you can open now is that PDF. which is a ransom note. This is an actual Riceta ransom note, not the one from the British Library. The actual victim has been redacted from this. And in it, they basically say, here's how to reach us. Let us talk to you about what you can pay us to get your data back. On the morning of the attack, the systems are down. This was the state of the British Library. Basically, everything was down. Wi-Fi was down. Staff had access to nothing. You couldn't call them on the phone. The phone systems were down. You couldn't buy tickets to an exhibition. Everything is down. And it is clear that they had a business continuity plan, and they promptly invoked it, declared an incident, and got the right, gold certification, people from their staff in there working on it. And this is what they eventually found out Riceta had done. It wasn't immediately clear, but just to complete the description of the attack, what Riceta did was steal data, and destroy machines. And that last one is really important. They stole data. I described already how they searched around and copied whatever they can find. They found 10 or 14 databases, whatever was in them they took. They found files they copied from everywhere, including, interestingly, and this will come back later, personal files from staff members, not business files, but personal files were up there, and some of those were stolen. The report says that the destruction of servers was the single most damaging thing they accomplished, not stealing the data. It was that they destroyed servers, which meant that although they had backups for most of this stuff, they couldn't restore them they had no viable infrastructure to restore them to. And what was meant by destroying servers will become a little clearer. So that's the attack. Let's think now about the details of recovery. How did they recover? What were the effects on the business of this attack? Well, the high points of this is just the first month after, some things that happened in the first month after the attack. They reopened after 2 days in a pre-digital state. 2 days later, you can walk in the door, but they can only offer you services that can be accomplished on paper. And from the description I gave you about what it takes to get a book out of Yorkshire, for example, you know that that's actually very little of their services are back up at this point. It's interesting to note, too, it was 2 weeks before the library made a public statement about the fact that there had been a ransomware attack, even though it was obvious to the public the library systems were down. And this is interesting. They spent a lot of time, and we'll come back to this a little bit, thinking about how to communicate and what to communicate. It was 2 weeks before that confirmation came out. And they confirmed, too, that personal data had been stolen. They said it was largely contact and demographic information, not SSN numbers or whatever the UK equivalent to that would be. Towards the end of this, you can see that we infer that the reason Riceta took 10% of the data they stole and put it up for auction on the dark web was a negotiating ploy over ransom, which the library had not paid, because it turns out, since they're a government agency, UK regulations forbid them to pay. So there was no chance Riceta was going to get ransom from this. Riceta was trying, and they put some of the data up for auction. A week later, they gave up. It was clear to them they weren't going to get any money from the library, so they just published all the data they stole and went on to the next attack, whatever that was. That's the end of Riceta in this story. The rest of this is really just about the British Museum, or the British Library. This slide talks about which systems came back most quickly. And the diagram is my diagram of the general situation we understand they had. You log in as a user, you get into the network, and the network is composed of multiple servers in different places. Some are in the library's data system, or data center, which they don't mention by name, but I know they do have. They did say they have physical servers. Those are housed somewhere. I'm calling that the data center. And they had some systems in the cloud that were largely their business systems, email, HR, things like that. The cloud systems came back relatively easily. Within a few days, the business part of things was back up and running. What didn't come back easily were the systems they owned, the things in their data center, the things that were custom built, the clunky stuff, I infer, again, that is their basic core service. That's what did not come back, and that's why the attack was so damaging, the loss of those machines. So the cloud worked for them in this case, and I infer that that's partly because the things that were in the cloud were third-party services, software as a system products that were doing HR and email for them, and those are managed by other people under their own security program with their own backups, and however they were affected, they were back up and running pretty well. So there's a good cloud story there. Some legacy systems were effectively destroyed because they couldn't be rebuilt, and this is one of the big lessons. They say things could not be rebuilt because the software that was deleted from the systems was no longer available because it was no longer supported by the person who made it. So they were continuing to use very old software, or they had old software that was still supported, but they couldn't take it forward on newly built infrastructure because it was incompatible with new systems. So for either of those reasons, when Raisada deleted vast things off of servers, they effectively destroyed those servers because they could not be rebuilt as they originally had been. And that is what's going to take them forever to recover from. Here's just a little bit about the PR side of it. I don't have a lot to say, but they were in national headlines, and they were tweeting regularly to reassure their customer base and their stakeholders. We're on it. This is what's happened. We're sorry. We're doing our best. This is not a place you want to be in, and you do want to be sure that your business continuity plan takes into account the need for this, that you've already thought about who is going to do that work, who has to review it before it's shown to the public, who's authorized to make statements like that. They seem to have done a good job of that part at least. Those were all things that had happened within the first month after the attack. Here's a little snapshot of how things looked 5 months later when the report came out. 5 months after the attack, these things were still true. There was only half the physical collection was accessible, even to staff. The website was still down. All their activity of digitization was still on pause, and they have major digitization projects. They archive all UK websites. They are partnering with Google to digitize things that were not originally digital. They have records from patent offices. They get copies of all things that are published in the UK, digital and otherwise. So the loss of the digitization feature is major. Their online learning resources are still out. Many important things are still out. This chart from the report shows their estimated timeline to recovery, and they divide their recovery efforts into 3 parts. Yeah, I see some gaping mouths. Yes. The first part was just to do the minimum, whatever it took to get anything back up that could be recovered. That's the short line, and that ends in, I can't see it from here, January? Last January. Yeah, the middle line was rebuilding enough things, anything that could be rebuilt to kind of restore essential services in the fastest, most efficacious way, whatever was recoverable, which wouldn't necessarily be everything. And that looks like it ended in the middle of this year. Not until middle of next year, 2025, will they finish the major effort, which is to rebuild their infrastructure and have a properly built, well-designed, secure from the beginning system and unified practices for managing the system we've all imagined they must have. And you can see why that would take so long. This screenshot from the British Library that I took a week ago shows that they are still not up, and you have to walk carefully through the minefields and figure out what's there and what isn't and whether you can get what you want. All right, so that's the effect of the attack and the scope of the recovery efforts. Let's look now at what the library says were their lessons learned. First, I'll start with what they say was the root cause of the problem, because understanding the root cause is the beginning of getting your lessons. You know, what actually went wrong? These are their own words, and I can summarize them more succinctly. The first 2 bullet points say, because so much of our legacy data operations are manual, properly isolating network segments was impractical. Our network was not segmented. Therefore, once the attackers were in, they had a relatively easy time finding anything. And that importance of network segmentation came up in one of the earlier talks today, too. The third bullet says, Raisada had destroyed servers we can't easily rebuild because they were so old. Those were the root causes of the problem. And notice, none of that really has to do with the data having been encrypted or ransomed. It's the loss of the servers that is the problem. So here are the 16 lessons they say they learned. I'm not going to read each one or make you do it. I will recap most of them on the slides that follow. What struck me when I saw this list, and this is the subtitle for my talk, how the ransomware taught the British Library to follow well-known best practices. Almost all the things on that list correspond very neatly and easily to things we already understand from any security specification you want to look at. To make that point, I've chosen NIST 853, but you could make the same point with ISO. Here's a handful of the same items. You can see the first two columns are the numbers from their list and the lessons from their list. The second two columns are my mapping to common NIST controls. So it's not quite fair to say that this taught them to do things. They were already doing most of these things. You know, the first point says, enhance our system monitoring. They were already monitoring their systems. They learned from the event they needed to do it better. One of the items is we need to do multi-factor authentication better, and I've already explained why to you. They had that. They learned they needed it more thoroughly. The next few slides, on the next few slides, I group some of the other lessons into ones I want to talk about, things that are interesting to me, the things that raised red flags or seemed like they provoked interesting thoughts from my point of view. The first cluster of them all are the ones that relate to having, most directly, to having dealt with legacy systems. So, of course, those need to be called out. And they say they need to manage the system's life cycle to eliminate legacy technology. What that means is tracking the systems they have and knowing when they go out of date and having those on a calendar and doing something before they go out of date, either replacing them with upgraded systems or rebuilding them if the system is going to become completely obsolescent. So people do this often. They think of it with their software. They don't always think of it with their servers. Or if they do, they don't prioritize it as high as fixing vulnerabilities. But not prioritizing it really bit them. And that's the last item in this page. You know, they say they need to prioritize things appropriately. So not having current software turned out to be the biggest vulnerability in their system. Not because a single 0 day wasn't patched, but because the whole system couldn't be rebuilt. These two items I enjoy thinking about because they clearly stem from conversations with leadership after the event. And you can imagine what those conversations must be like. I certainly don't know exactly what happened at the British Library, and I'm tempted to infer things. If I do, don't take me as a legitimate source. I'm tempted to infer there were conversations like, you didn't tell us that could happen. We had no idea that if those systems would be down, our main functions would be gone for 1.5 years. How come we on the board didn't know that? What's wrong with our risk tracking? Because they clearly had a risk register. They clearly had a governance system. Those conversations did occur. And they're saying that they need to maintain a holistic view of cyber risk. And I don't know exactly what they mean by it, but it's clearly pointed at the risk management system. And I have to say, it is a hard problem. They point out that they're pretty direct about part of it. Their risk program did bring many things to the attention of the board. The board felt, I don't know if this is really the board saying it, I infer, the board felt that the cumulative effect of some of the lower priority things was not clear to them. So they wish they had had a bigger picture and not just the high-level things brought to their attention. I give them credit for saying that they not only need to change their risk management, but also ensure in the next point that their board has adequate expertise to understand the information that is being brought to them. I really do think they've done a good analysis, and I admire what's in this report very much. I am absolutely in awe of what they pulled off in being able to be this forward, this direct about what happened. These two point to a part of a smaller point, but something that was a complete surprise to me. I did not see this coming. Their acceptable use policies specifically allowed their employees to put personal files on file shares, at least under some circumstances. I don't know what. And this bit them. Clearly, you can imagine what would happen if you had personal files, I don't know what, your rugby card collection or your insurance papers, I don't know what, your passport, a Xerox of your passport you put together before you traveled, and that got stolen in the breach. Think of the conversation you might then have with your employer about what they might owe you in damages, I suppose. Clearly, conversations like that happened, and they are resolving that now in their business continuity plan, they need to think about the wellness of the employees. And I'm used to wellness of employees in like a pandemic plan, or if your threat model includes bombs, sure. But I'm not used to seeing that in ransomware. And so you might think about your business situation. What do you have on your laptop? What does your employer say is okay to have in your email? Because that could be taken in an attack. Another very good thing they did was to take new risks, acknowledge new risks as a result of the process they'd gone through. Having changed so much by going through the attack and putting up new systems as they plan to do, they will incur new risks, and they're very clear about that. First, because they were a visible, very visible victim of an attack, they will now be more visible targets, and they are more likely to fall victim or to be attacked or to have attempts taken against them. I see people nodding. I won't say more about that. That's clear. So that's a new risk that changes the threat model. There's a cultural change. This is my favorite one on the list. Remember, they have a plan of over a year and a half to rebuild their infrastructure, and not all systems will be online until that's done. So they identify as a risk the cultural pressure that they may encounter from the desire for business to return back to normal as quickly as possible. There will be both internal and external constituents who want everything back as quickly as it can be brought back for very good reasons. But if they take shortcuts to make that happen in their year-and-a-half-long plan, then there's a risk that they will compromise the protections they had planned to deliver with that. So that's a really important thing to acknowledge. And it's true, it plays out in many businesses. I've seen that everywhere. That's common. But they're very clear about it. The fourth bullet is that part of the plan involves rebuilding legacy systems that were complicated and not fully understood. And so one risk is that their timeline might be off. They don't really know how long it's going to take to rebuild those servers. So that's a risk. And they have, since they're moving some of their systems that weren't on the cloud before to the cloud, they acknowledge that comes with risks they may not yet fully understand. Excellent clarity of thought there, I think. This is the best one of all, and it goes with a quote this morning from Steve Allison. I forget exactly what it was. Never let any breach go to waste. Yeah, this is the silver lining slide. So the report says the disruption from the attack creates an opportunity to implement significant structural changes in ways that would otherwise have been considered too disruptive to countenance. I completely understand. If you go to any board and say, we're going to take down half your services for a year and a half in order to rebuild the infrastructure, they're going to say, wait a minute, that's not a good plan. We have to do something else. And yet that is exactly what they're going to do now. Their services will be down, and they are going to rebuild the systems. And it's going to cost a lot of money. And this is a hard problem. I'm not blaming the board in that case. I wouldn't have said, yeah, it's okay to take everything down. I'm sure there was a way they could have phased something in if they had time and support, but even that would have been disruptive and expensive and might have taken too long. The attack might still have happened. So, hard problem always, balancing how much money you want to devote to defense when you don't really know if you're going to need it or not. I put a few resources that are links here to information about the British Library, information from CISA about how to prevent ransomware, and if it was the RISA details that piqued your curiosity, there's information too, some detailed information about how they attack. That's all I've got. Thank you. I very much appreciate your attention. If there is time, I'd be happy to take questions, and I'll certainly be around afterwards in any case.